Hello and welcome to Choral Kaleidoscope. I'm your host, Janelle Dill. And in episode number 6, I'm going to be talking about the very first book I ever did, The Belonging Place, where I had a class to go with it, where I talked about stages towards creating interdependent community. It was sort of a thesis of some sort where I wanted people to know how to create one cohesive unit to bring disabled and able-bodied together in sort of a community better, and how we can be better at allying, which is my huge goal, that we can sort of have a better integrated, interdependent community. I wrote it because I wanted to find a better way to access it, because let's face it, folks, social media has a very slanted and biased view of disabled folk. The movies can't tell you very well what disabled life is like. Television is not very good at it. It has a bad track record. And history, of course, has a not so great track record either. And if you really want to know, if you want to know what disabled life is like, you should honestly follow Disabled Folk online. It's the best source you could get for disabled life. Talk to disabled folks. That's the best advice I can give you, to follow disabled folk, to learn about disabled folk, be friends with disabled folk, listen to what disabled folk have to say, and please take their word for it. So I created the book. I asked to do the class. I got a yes to do the class. No, it wasn't from a community college. It was actually at a church. I didn't have a lot of attendees, and then I posted it on YouTube. You can find it on this YouTube channel, just to let people know how to better incorporate. And what I did was I put in examples of movies that most people would know, and some television shows. Of course, the list is growing much longer now, and I put some questions to think about, and people can answer them at their leisure and discuss it. And there's different sections in the book that I talk about, such as scars and fears and phobias. There's belonging and inclusion and accommodations. And of course, belonging is the last stage, which is very important, but I don't think we'll ever in this world reach it perfectly, because it's always a process. And every time I think we hope to move forward, we end up going back about 5 extra steps, and we have to keep addressing it over and over again. So for this time, instead of me reading the whole book, I'm just gonna give you a quick gloss over. I gave you a quick gloss over of what the book was about and why I wrote it, rather than reading you a big long section and why I wrote this book. I've also included I also wanted to include some history and some pictures and different laws, and I wanted to put some historical images too, so people know, well, before, the Americans with Disabilities Act, you weren't allowed, you weren't allowed to go out to certain places because they weren't accessible, like riding a bus. They had laws called the ugly laws, and I had a picture from another website that had a picture of a poster that would prohibit you from begging on the streets. They called them ugly laws. It was absolutely terrible, and I thought it would be important to incorporate that into my book, because a lot of kids, if they learn about disability history, they only get a limited view of it. You only hear about maybe Albert Einstein, or you hear about Helen Keller, and that's the only access. You don't hear about the Americans with Disabilities Act. You don't hear about the Gallaudet University protest. You don't hear about the ugly laws. You don't hear about what happened with the controversial experiments during World War II on disabled folks, especially those in the autistic community. You don't hear about those things. You don't hear about mental institutions in the documentary that was done by Bobby Kennedy. You don't hear about those things. You don't know about the Capitol Crawl. You don't learn about those things in school. So I thought it was important for me to sort of give them a little bit of a heads up on what some of the history was. And it's kind of funny that I go right back to where I started from with neurodiversity. I go back to it and I write more from a personal perspective instead of this academic perspective, because my first book was very academic and it had questions and answers, of course, but it was more from an academic slash teacher perspective as a disabled person, where I kind of felt like, here I am, I'm a disabled person, I want to prove my degree. And now here I am years later going, yeah, I'm a disabled person, but I don't need to have a big PhD to prove that my disabled life is worth something. So I just kind of revisited it and I thought, you know what? I'm just going to write it in another perspective. But my first book was definitely more academic. And if you've read it, which I hope some of you did, you'll realize I'm a totally different writer from my first book, where I'm very academic and I sound so educated, compared to my other book where I am educated, but I talk more to the people, rather than my first book where I was kind of talking above people a little bit, and I had to tone down my academia language a bit, because my editor, I'll never forget it, she says, well, Janelle, you gotta bring it down. I don't understand what you're saying, because she had no idea on the disabled vocabulary. And I had to tone it down, explain things, break it down into simpler language and not so complex, and not throw out so many statistics. Oh man, that book was my early version of it. I'm so glad none of you are reading the earliest copies of it. It was a disaster. I think I had too many statistics in it. I had too much academia language. I sounded like a professor whose book you never want to read. And I toned it down to reach more people. And now that I've written my neurodiversity book, which is kind of bringing it back around, it's more accessible. And my goal has always been to make it accessible. So the blogging place gave me a first sense of making it accessible to people. And after I wrote that book, I thought, I should make it even more accessible through my poetry. And so I did. I hope you've enjoyed episode number 6 and the other episodes. If you haven't listened to any of the episodes, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Perplexity Epilepsy. Remember, it's purple with XITY at the end. So it's purple with XITY, Perplexity Epilepsy. Because remember, you can't spell perplexity without purple in it. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard so far, please consider becoming an ally by subscribing and patronizing my Patreon page, www.patreon.com/epivision. That's EPIVISION. For as little as $3 a month, you'll receive some pretty cool items, such as stickers, newsletters, early access to projects I'm working on, any upcoming projects I'm doing, and for this month only, you will receive a special gift from me. No, I can't tell you what it is yet. You have to subscribe and go to the Patreon page to find out what it is. You can also check out more of my work on my WordPress page. That's www.plasmnetic, that's plasmnetic.wordpress.com, where you can check out the rest of my works. That's poetry, such as poetry, reflections, pictures, and there'll be images, and there's images on there from my Instagram and connections to my Facebook and more, and links to my Lulu page. There's also links to my Lulu page and Amazon. If you want to purchase any books, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please stay tuned for episode number 7.